And now for our regular scheduled programming. For those of you joining us for the first time, everything in Dungeons and Drag Queens is determined by a dice roll. High rolls are good, low rolls are bad. That's all you need to know.
Dungeons and Dragons begins with the Dungeon Master, or DM, creating a campaign. This is the quest or story that the player's characters undergo, and the world that it's set in. The other players create characters to adventure together as a team, each playing as the character they develop.
No two campaigns are alike, and players might hold sessions for days, months, or even years to complete the campaign. It is then up to the imagination of the players, with guidance of the Dungeon Master, and some luck of a dice roll, to determine the fate of the quests and characters. Dungeons and Dragons is possibly the most well-known fantasy tabletop role-playing game, having been around since the mid-1970s. It is estimated that over 20 million people have played.
Considering that collective imagination is a key aspect, it is unsurprising that players are finding new, innovative ways to enjoy the game. Podcasts, novelizations, and spin-off games created by fans are just the beginning.
Dungeons and Dragons is a fantasy role-playing game with dice and your imagination.
You're creating this story with other people, and you don't know where it's going to go.
It's one of the oldest kind of role-playing games. Video games themselves don't really offer the same avenues for different choices because the world can only really adapt to the kinds of things that it was prepared and programmed to do.
Hi, so we've come in recording. You can keep playing the music if you like, it's alright.
Well, I mean, I figure there's a lot of sounds going on, so
That's
it's
fair.
probably better for editing if there are slightly less sounds going on.
That's fair.
Oh my god, man. How you doing?
Sitting on the table in the middle of the room is a bowl, holding a variety of colorful dice. We're here to discuss Peak's involvement with a fan-created show that is currently in Sydney.
Hi, I'm Peak, and I am the Dungeon Master for Dungeons and Drag Queens. It's a live comedy improv show where I run Dungeons and Dragons for a bunch of drag queens. In high school, I was introduced to Dungeons and Dragons very briefly. I was involved in a couple campaigns here and there, ran some of my own. The director of the original Dungeons and Drag Queens that was performed in Sydney back in March of this year, Alex Radovan, who has a production company called Abduction Productions, and he just woke up one day, I think he just thought of the pun, thought it was cool, and made it happen. Up until that point, I'd always thought, I don't know why I haven't done drag yet. Like, maybe it's the money, maybe it's the lack of skill, but I was always halfway to doing drag, and I was thinking, well, it'll just need that extra push. So when there was a casting call going out for Dungeons and Drag Queens, I thought, well, and at that point, I was already DMing several campaigns, maybe 3 at that time, maybe more. And I thought, well, this is the perfect marriage of drag and D&D. This is perfect for me. So I auditioned and thought I did terribly, and then I got the part.
Hello, my name is Julian. I am a homosexual man who enjoys D&D at least once a fortnight. Peak obviously is my housemate, and we've been friends for like years. And I always wanted to get into D&D through all of these references in pop culture. I always wanted to have some sort of part of it. And I think growing up, I never really had that sort of community. And then through a group called the Sydney Gamers, I met other people. And then he was just talking to me one day about a campaign, and then we just decided to make one. Sydney Gamers is a local, I think it's got 3,000 members at this point, Facebook group with a bunch of like-minded queer geeks of all different types.
The director was moving to Melbourne. Then one of my castmates at the time, he decided to keep it going and having meetings and doing planning, and scored us a monthly spot at the Imperial. We needed a DM, and he asked me because I was always the rules guy when we were doing the previous show.
I remember one moment he was trying to audition for it and was trying to rehearse in front of me and had some form of stage fright, which was hilarious because he couldn't, for the life of him, for some reason. He had practiced it for hours by himself, but the minute I was there and he was practicing in front of me, it was like freaking him out. If you've never seen a sort of drag performance or D&D, you'd be a little confused, but all in all, I think you'd be really entertained and just be laughing at the confusion.
The city that it's all set in is called Zan Moxie. So it's this big fantasy city. Everyone comes from all over to Zan Moxie to make it big. It's a big city with big glamorous lights. There's showbiz, there's bars, there's performances. It's ruled by the 4 fashion houses. So we have the House of Steel, who create these beautiful metal garments with filigreed metal accessories and just very fashionable heavy armor. You have the House of Mink, which is all about being entirely extra. We have the House of Noir, sleek, black, velvety. They control the flow of essence in the city. It's what everything runs on. And also, finally, we have the House of Silk, who make these beautiful, colorful silk garments. There are airships, people are flying around, they're going to bars. There's a unicorn at a bar drinking whiskey out of a tumbler glass. It's a very urban sort of vibe, but it's still kind of got that sort of fantasy aesthetic of being from another time. Kind of like Bioshock, but a lot less depressing.
His boyfriend Ryan does all these like voiced recaps every week.
I do all of the recaps in kind of like a Penny Dreadful kind of like radio play style. It's extremely familiar if you've happened to watch The Legend of Korra. And I do interstitial ad breaks with Peak for Dungeons and Drag Queens, which are ads that play for things that don't really exist.
Parents, have your children been distant of late? Are they more forgetful than you remember? Have they burst into starlight and ascended into one of many glorious astral planes? Your children may be experimenting with the eldritch mysteries of the cosmos.
So officially, the very first drag performance I've ever done was actually for the last Dungeons and Drag Queens show, where I performed as Anaphylaxis, and that was my first legit full-on drag with like full-on heels, makeup, costume, everything. Prior to that, I do draggy sort of looks for Halloween parties and things like that. I performed karaoke on stage in like a red dress sort of thing that I sourced from the audience to Kate Bush's Wuthering Heights. So there was a lot of like pre-drag before my official drag debut. In the previous show, we were playing as well as doing musical numbers. And in the new format, those of us at the table are playing and the muses are doing the musical numbers. We are not as busy trying to learn a dance every month. They're kind of like the Hercules muses, where they're kind of just, they're around, they do a little dance, they kind of host the event and have really cool, narratively focused musical numbers. I frame the show as kind of like a radio show, and they're just a musical act that plays. I kind of just wear just some trousers, a collared shirt tucked in, and I've just got some red suspenders. It's very simple, but it fits. I might add some more bells and whistles to my costuming, because I feel a little bad that I show up for the show and all the other queens are getting ready in the dressing room and they're not ready until we're about to go on.
Dungeons and Drag Queens is the logical overlap of the kind of nerd and gay community in Sydney. So kind of has a large overlap with the gamers community, GAYMERS. And I don't know, exploring that intersection is particularly interesting because there's kind of universal experiences that people in the LGBTQIA plus community have that can also be expressed through the sphere of gaming. Like a lot of the characters tend to be non-binary or non-gender conforming or have minority sexual orientations, and that manifests itself in a really, really interesting way in the kind of storytelling experience.
The idea of role-playing as a certain character that's not your own and living someone else's life is something that I think a lot of queer people, especially queer teens, want and sort of live out and want in their own fantasies. So I think Dungeons and Drag Queens kind of combines those two big communities together because it combines that sense of role-playing in fantasy lore and all that with Dungeons and Dragons with the role-playing you get in drag queen personas.
One of the really good things about the intersection of any LGBTQIA culture and geek culture is that it brings people kind of out of their shell who might not have previously been. That was my experience with the Sydney chapter of Gamers, which was, I was an incredibly socially anxious person, still am, but it was very, very helpful.
Like, I've not received any criticism personally. I haven't really discussed it with my mother. I'm not sure how she would take it. More that I think she wouldn't understand. But my sister, she's a makeup artist. She was like, "Oh wow, that looks amazing." I am in a very left-leaning, very queer bubble in the people that I'm friends with and interact with. So there isn't really that much. Like, I'm not expecting any backlash. And I haven't been proven wrong yet. I adore drag as an art form. I think it's such a cool way to turn gender expression into art and cool performances and to humor. The drag that I believe in and the drag queens that I love, they're about expressing their sexuality and gender and making fun of it or tearing it to pieces or whatever it is they feel they need to do or what they want to do, and just in a really cool and entertaining way. The setting itself for Dungeons and Drag Queens, it's just a fantasy setting, but there's just something about it that's just very campy and queer without being overtly like, oh, here's a gay pun or here's just a tacky reference to some throwaway joke. It's just the world itself is queer because the people who created it are queer and have queer sensibilities. D&D itself is very performative and theatrical, and what better combination with that is drag. In telling these stories coming from a source that might not necessarily be the mainstream, you're just adding more diversity to the fantasy genre. I like my fantasy fun, gay, full of female characters, which is not exactly what you get in a lot of fantasy. The message that the show promotes is diversity.
It is so wonderful to watch the kind of thing that I've already seen in a much more muted, kind of friendly, relaxed environment be so similarly represented on stage.
It's funny watching from the sidelines and being like, oh, that character voice that he's done is several characters in my campaign. Like, a running joke I have with him is that he has about 4 to 5 character voices. He's very, very good at creating lore and everything. And I think if anyone has ever been in a campaign with Peak, they will recognize trends from that in this campaign, which is part of why you like it, because there's a charm to it. There was a joke in our Facebook group, in our Facebook chat, about how I didn't understand what the word mitigator was, or mitigating. And he then created a boss that was a crocodile creature with the head of a crocodile and a human body called the Mitigator that we fought. And that's one of the examples.
From all campaigns, I think my favorite character the Peak has ever done is Ornithresk, who is a ibis druid who is kind of kin with garbage.
Hello, I'm Ornithresk, and I do not know where this voice came from, but I feel like it fit this garbage character.
Wears a giant garbage can on his back, collects all garbage, uses it to manifest druidic powers. As a druid would, warp nature, he warps trash.
I recently died and was infested with some kind of mushroom zombie virus, and I am now one with the spore.
I also DM a campaign that Peak is part of, which is a kind of Victorian Eldritch universe-hopping campaign where he plays Rufus Nightjar.
I always find the voice for this character by saying the name of his partner, Mr. Finch. That's a preposterous thing to say. Magic does not exist.
Who will see something explicitly magical happen in front of them and go, the wind changed, the wind made that fire appear.
So one of the characters that I had in the previous session of Dungeons and Drag Queens was the ghostly debutante who was murdered. I am Lady Esmeralda Vandergeist. I was inspired by Storm from the 90s X-Men cartoon.
Peak's personality comes through in the way that he explains the world, in the things that he finds particularly important, in the way in which he guides or gently nudges the players towards or away from certain obstacles and objectives.
Because it is a live show, as a DM and as a player, I'm not just playing and collaborating with the players, I'm also playing and collaborating with the audience. If a player wants to do something, it's more exciting if I just allow that to happen. Obviously, I don't just let it happen. I roll dice, I make them justify it, but it's not about sticking to the rules properly. It's just what's the most fun, what's the most entertaining. Actually, with the previous session, I had a little skeleton for how the session was going to go. They followed the red herring that I placed out of the mansion, and I hadn't planned for anything outside of the mansion, which kind of devolved into this hilarious scene where the players were rolling down a hill in pursuit of this halfling. The show was wrapping up. I had to end it somehow, and I was just thinking, I haven't planned any of this. What's going on? Oh god, this needs to have a satisfying narrative conclusion. And one of the players called a Zan Uber and just flew them out of there while they were just being chased by police airships. I never thought about that. Is there an Uber equivalent in this city? Because that's not the number one world building question. But the player said that. I said, sure, that makes sense. Cool. Maybe you have a little scrying orb that lets you call a Zan Uber. And now I've just thought about that, and I have just that exists in the city now. There are airships that you can just call with a scrying orb. Currently, we're trying to get it off the ground as a podcast for people who can't make the show. That'll be really cool because we can just edit together and just add in all the extra little fluff that we've created, like the in-world ads for intermission background noise. On top of that, I think as the show evolves, it'll be really cool to see all the different guests that we have. At this point, we're still establishing what Zan Moxie is. Eventually, once that everyone has a pretty good idea of that, I think it'd be really cool to do like genre-based sessions.
Speaking with Peak, Julian, and Ryan, it is clear that Dungeons and Dragons has impacted their lives, acting as a way to connect with others as well as an outlet for self-expression. Dungeons and Drag Queens is an extension and a celebration of this, allowing Peak and the rest of the cast to share their imagination, humour, and love of the game with anyone lucky enough to be in the audience.